What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the Monday, July 22nd edition of the Ship My Money Show. I'm your host, Adam Scherer. You can follow me on Twitter at ShipMyMoney DFS. And we're back from a pretty long layoff. Obviously, we had the All-Star break. I didn't do a show on Friday, so haven't done a show in a little over a week. Glad to be back. Thank you guys for tuning in. Don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel. All that stuff helps out quite a bit. And as usual, we're going to walk game by game through today's 9-game MLB slate. Looking at specifically DraftKings, but if anything pops up that is really different on FanDuel or that you have a specific question about, let me know and I'll try and figure out an answer. But yeah, as always, just going to go through game by game. If you are watching this back later and looking for anything in particular, you can always see where I'm at by using this banner here at the top and seeing which games are highlighted. But other than that, going to be a normal show. It doesn't look like we have any weather issues today. Nice 9-game slate. Should be pretty fun. We do have a Coors Field game with the Red Sox in Colorado. Some other pretty good offensive spots as well. And we're going to start with the Reds taking on the Braves in Atlanta. Relatively low total in this game with Hunter Green facing off against Ronaldo Lopez. Both of these pitchers are getting a lot of ownership, and it does look pretty warranted. You can see here that I'm almost exactly even with the field on both of these guys as far as optimal percentage versus projected ownership. Green pulling about 28% on DraftKings, Lopez pulling about 19%. I don't have any problem with either of those. Obviously, the Reds offense isn't as good as the Atlanta offense, but the Atlanta offense is very banged up as well. They were already missing Acuna, already missing Harris. Ozzie Albies now out for a couple of months with, I believe, a fractured wrist. So they still have some talent. Like they still have Ozuna, they still have Olsen. There are still some guys in this lineup that can hit, but this Atlanta lineup's getting pretty bad pretty quickly. Their active roster right now has a 90 WRC plus against right-handed pitching this season. They rank 6th in strikeout percentage. It's not looking really good for them. And then on the other side, Cincinnati ranks 3rd in strikeout percentage, a 100 WRC plus overall. Obviously, that is pulled up a bit by Elly De La Cruz individually as well. That's one thing to keep in mind, too, when you're looking at an average like that. If you have a star player like De La Cruz, they will tend to pull that number up. But obviously, you're still only facing him once every time through the order, so it's not exactly the perfect way to look at it. Either way, pretty good matchup for both of these guys. Green is only $8,200 as well, so that's a good price tag there. He has a 27.5% strikeout percentage. That is the second highest on the slate. Tarek Skubal is not on the slate, so second highest strikeout percentage on the slate for Hunter Green. 4.17 xFIP. He has done a better job this year of limiting power against him also. And then he gets out of Cincinnati here. Atlanta, not a terrible place to hit, but it's not Great American Ballpark. So that's at least somewhat of an upgrade for Green as well. Certainly looks good at this price tag. On the other side, Ronaldo Lopez has been a really nice surprise. I don't know if surprise is the right word, but moved from the bullpen into the starting rotation this year. Hasn't really missed a beat. Striking out 24.5% of hitters, 3.79 xFIP, good matchup. 9K price tag is reasonable. Both of these pitchers look good. Offensively, I wouldn't anticipate getting to a lot of either stack outside of maybe your larger field tournaments where you're just looking to target against the ownership that these pitchers are getting. But neither of these teams look like, the highest probability teams to get to. The matchups are obviously difficult for both. Elly De La Cruz at 5,900 showing up as the top hitting play from this game for me. There's nothing really surprising there. Obviously, he gives you legitimate stolen base upside in addition to power upside. He'll be hitting from the left side against Lopez, which is his dominant side. So if you can get to De La Cruz, great. He always looks good. 5% ownership. He's always a fun contrarian play at low ownership. But for the most part, offensively, outside of the game theory considerations in tournaments, I don't really see much reason to be looking to the bats from this one. Next, we have the Phillies going into Minnesota to take on the Twins. So Park downgrade for the Phillies bats, Park upgrade for Ranger Suarez. And I'm pretty much in line with the field on both of these guys as well. They're both getting around 10, 11% ownership. They both showed up as optimal about 10% of the time for me. Suarez having a very, very solid season so far for the Phillies, striking out 24.5% of hitters. Excellent 3.03 xFIP. Pretty mediocre matchup against the Twins. Not great, not terrible. They are 9th in strikeout percentage with a 105 WRC plus against left-handed pitching on their active roster since the start of last season. Bailey Ober, tough matchup for him, but he is a solid pitcher. He is reasonably priced at 8,300. 26.5% K percentage is the 4th highest on this slate behind Bregans, Green, and Blake Snell. 3.78 xFIP. And again, it is a park downgrade for the Phillies. They are still a good offense, though. They're ranked 19th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching. They have a 110 WRC plus. In a lot of spots, an $8,300 Bailey Ober would be very popular here. In this matchup against the Phillies, he's more of a secondary option. So both of these guys look fine, but there are some bigger priorities that we will get to, including the two pitchers that we talked about in the previous game. I don't anticipate getting a ton of the offenses here either. The park isn't great for power. The Phillies, at least the ones that you would want to get to, are pretty expensive. Real Muto is fairly priced at $4,500, so I think that is something that is noteworthy and interesting to point out here. But Bryce Harper, Alec Boehm, Kyle Schwarber, all relatively expensive. They do give you a very high ceiling if you can get to them, but in a matchup against Ober, I just don't think that's a huge priority. So they do look like more of a secondary stack here. Ober this year allowing a 158 expected ISO to lefties, 194 to righties. So he has given up a little bit more power in that split. Probably, stabilizes. He gives up some power overall, but certainly not any sort of gas can. Ranger Suarez, very good pitcher on the other side. And then one other thing to keep in mind with Minnesota is that this is a team that tends to platoon pretty heavily. So be careful with who you're going to in their lineup if you do go to the Twins. Depending on what that lineup looks like when it's released, you could have several left-handed hitters waiting to pinch hit. So that's something that we'll have to keep an eye on. If they go with a lineup that has the lefties in it, then obviously there isn't the same level of pinch hit risk, but then you have guys in that lefty-lefty matchup against Suarez, which isn't ideal either. Brewers are taking on the Cubs in Wrigley Field. Pretty low total in this game as well. So not very exciting hitting games through the first three. Tobias Myers and Javier Assad on the mound in this one. Myers getting some ownership at 7,200. Showed up as optimal about 10% of the time for me. I don't really have any issues with that at the cheap price tag. Strikeout stuff is decent. 21.5% K percentage this year, 4.02 xFIP. The Cubs active roster ranks 7th in strikeout percentage. So there is some upside for Myers here, and he is pretty cheap. On the other side for Assad, he has had a solid season, but this is a tough matchup for him going up against Milwaukee. He's not showing up much for me, not showing up much for the field. Don't really see a lot of reason to get to him. The Brewers active roster ranks 17th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching, 113 WRC plus. I think there's just going to be better spots to get to, both from a value standpoint and also from a projection standpoint. I'm pulling it up now, too, because if I remember correctly, he's been on the injured list, but I want to double check that because obviously everything just kind of runs together with the All-Star break. He did return right before the break. He threw 44 pitches against St. Louis. So I don't know exactly what to expect as far as pitch count goes because we did have the All-Star break. I have no idea how many bullpens he threw during that time, how stretched out he got during those bullpens. But there does seem to be a pretty good chance that he's not fully stretched out. So that combined with the matchup against the Brewers, I think makes it pretty difficult to want to get to Assad. But neither of these pitchers are terrible. Neither of these offenses look all that great here either. Milwaukee is the team that I would prefer getting to. We can see as far as all stacks go, they are showing up a bit right now for me. Also, 5-man showing up a little bit more than I expected. I don't know if that holds, but you do have pretty favorable pricing here. The Brewers have been really, really expensive all season long, or at least for most of the season. And that is coming down now. So I guess that does drive them up a little bit just when you think about it from an upside standpoint that, they do have a lot of power in this lineup. They are pretty cheap. Assad has allowed a 208 expected ISO to righties as well, 162 expected ISO to lefties. So there is some power upside there. And I think you're really just seeing those stacks being driven by the positions that these guys play as well. William Contreras, 5,100 at catcher. So you're getting him at a cheaper price tag than normal. And obviously it's tough to find upside at catcher. Willie Adames, only 4,300 at shortstop. This is somebody that typically is, like 10, 15% more expensive than that. Bryce Turang, most likely leading off, 4,400 at second base. He's been up around 5K a lot recently. So you are getting some discounted Milwaukee bats. Again, Assad has been an overall pretty decent pitcher this year, but he has given up some power. 4.36 xFIP overall, 21.5% K percentage. So as I talk through it, I do understand why Milwaukee is showing up more than I expected to see when I first clicked on the stacks. It's just, I think, a combination of the positions that they play and the fact that they are getting a little bit of discounted pricing here compared to where you normally see them. On the other side, Chicago not getting much ownership and probably shouldn't. They look like maybe going a little bit under-owned here. Suzuki, Morel, Swanson, all projected to be a little bit lower owned than their optimal percentage, but nothing that really stands out. Those guys do have some power, but overall, the Cubs lineup, not quite as impressive as the Brewers lineup. Myers has allowed a 201 expected ISO to righties this year, but he has also struck them out at a 26% clip. So you see splits for Myers where he's actually been reverse splits as far as power numbers allowed, but he's been traditional as far as he is striking righties out about 10% more often than lefties, 26 to 16%. So nothing that really stands out there. But again, if you want to get to a little bit of Suzuki or Christopher Morel or Swanson at pretty cheap price tags, nothing wrong with that. But they don't look like priorities here. White Sox going into Texas to take on the Rangers. Good hitters park here. Michael Lorenzen for the Rangers, Eric Fedde going for the White Sox. Neither pitcher getting a ton of ownership. Lorenzen getting around 8%, showed up as being optimal about 9% in a very good matchup against the White Sox. Lorenzen himself, not a great pitcher, not a great strikeout pitcher, only a 17.5% strikeout percentage this year. He's walked about 12% of hitters, 4.99 xFIP, but you do get this matchup with the White Sox that can make anybody look decent. They rank 12th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year, but they also only have an 85 WRC plus. So if you land on a little bit of $7,600 Lorenzen, I think that looks fine. But again, he's not a great pitcher on his own. Eric Fedde is having a solid season for the White Sox, 21.5% K percentage, 3.84 xFIP. Relatively difficult matchup, though, going up against Texas. They rank 26th in strikeout percentage. They do only have a 91 WRC plus on their active roster, but that can also be a little bit misleading when you look at the actual players and their track records on the Rangers. There's just a pretty good chance that from this point on, they outproduce what they have to this point in the season. But Fedde at 7,400, I do think he's going a little bit under-owned here. He showed up as optimal 8% of the time. He's getting 3% ownership. It kind of just looks like somebody where if you're playing large field tournaments and you need a low-owned pitcher because you have a popular stack or popular one-offs or whatever it may be, Fedde is fine, but he's not somebody I'd be going out of my way to get to. I'd be surprised if I get to him in small field or anything like that. Offensively, the Rangers are showing up sixth most often as far as stacks go. The White Sox are showing up fifth. Again, this is a pretty good matchup for the White Sox. It's just that the White Sox themselves aren't very good, but you do get some value here. Andrew Benintendi, 2,700, probably hitting near the top of the order. The problem is he doesn't really give you a ton of upside. He doesn't hit for power. He probably will get some ownership as well, projected between 8 and 9%. But if he is opening up good stacks, good pitching, a lot of upside elsewhere, I think it's fine. Obviously not the most exciting individual player, though. Andrew Vaughn has some power. Luis Robert, I really like. Only getting 2 to 3% ownership right now. Lorenzen does struggle with power. Righties this year in particular have a 239 expected ISO against him compared to 122 for lefties. That sets up really, really nicely for Luis Robert. Now, one negative here is that Michael Lorenzen is pretty good at preventing stolen bases. When you roster Robert, you're not only getting that home run upside, but you are also hoping for stolen base upside. Lorenzen can make that part of his game a little bit more difficult, but at the plate, this sets up as a pretty nice spot for Luis Robert. I like him as a one-off. I like him in mini stacks. For Texas, they look fine. Eric Fedde, not a terrible pitcher, but Eric Fedde also not a great pitcher. He has done a pretty good job limiting power this year with a 148 expected ISO to righties, 159 to lefties. Corey Seager, if you can get to him, obviously great. Projected for 14% ownership, showing up as optimal about 11% of the time for me. Never going to be upset getting to Seager. Marcus Semien getting some ownership at second base. I think he's going a little bit over-owned, but he does look like a completely reasonable second base option. So both of these teams look fine. Neither one looks, like a can't miss offense or anything, but there are things to like about both of them. Diamondbacks are going into Kansas City to take on Cole Reagans and the Royals. Cole Reagans coming in at $9,000, projected for 20% ownership. Gilbert Diaz on the other side, 8K price tag, not getting any ownership and probably shouldn't against a Kansas City team that is very difficult to strike out in a park where it is difficult to get strikeouts. Reagans is a very high upside pitcher. I mentioned it already, but he has the highest strikeout percentage on the slate this season at 29.5%, 3.17 xFIP. Very, very good pitcher. Not the best matchup against Arizona. Their active roster against left-handed pitching ranks 25th in strikeout percentage since the start of last year. They also have a 114 WRC plus. And also, like I mentioned a minute ago, this park is difficult for getting strikeouts. It's towards the bottom of the league in park factor for strikeouts. So Reagans does certainly give you a very high ceiling. He is reasonably priced at 9K. He is just showing up a little bit over-owned for me when you factor in the park and the matchup, but it's still Cole Reagans, still gives you a very high ceiling. I don't mind getting to him, although I do think he's going a little bit over-owned, while some of these other popular pitchers like Green and like Lopez are showing up as more correctly owned for me. And again, I don't really see any reason to get to Diaz. Kansas City showing up middle of the pack for stacks. I kind of thought they'd show up a little bit better here, given that they're facing an unproven pitcher in Diaz. They're at home in a park that plays to their strengths. Again, Kauffman Stadium, not good for hitting home runs, but it is good for basically everything else: singles, doubles, triples, run scoring in general. And you're going up against a pitcher in Yolber Diaz, who made 4 starts at AAA this year. Other than that, had not pitched above AA. So now in his career, he has a total of 6 appearances above the AA level. He's going up against this Kansas City offense that does have upside here. I thought they'd show up a little bit more than they are. If that changes and I get to more of them later, that obviously would be perfectly fine with me. Bobby Witt Jr. individually is showing up the most for me from this game. About a 9% chance of being optimal at 6,400, 8% projected ownership. So he looks pretty good. Vinny Pasquantino, Adam Frazier as a value play look fine. Frazier is somebody that I would be cautious with his ownership, though. He's projected for about 11 to 12%. He only showed up as optimal about 6% of the time. Very much like Andrew Benintendi. He is going to project as a good point per dollar value because he is cheap and most likely hitting at the top of the order. But he's just not somebody that's hitting a lot of home runs for you. He's not stealing tons of bases. He's not running like Bobby Witt does. So he is somebody that I think there is a tendency for the field to just play a little bit more than is warranted by his range of outcomes. But from a value standpoint, especially with multi-position eligibility, he does look good in that regard. Gabby Moreno showing up 3,600. Not a good matchup against Regans, but that is a pretty good price tag for a catcher in Moreno that does have some ability to hit. So I understand why he's showing up a little bit. Then you also factor in that he does negatively correlate with a popular pitcher that appears to be going a little bit over-owned. And he makes some sense in tournaments as a one-off or part of a mini stack with Arizona, particularly in your larger field tournaments. But overall, it is a tough spot to want to get to the Diamondbacks. They look like they're going a little bit under-owned. Christian Walker has a ton of power. Vital Marte has a lot of upside. But the matchup against Regans is very difficult. And then one other thing to keep in mind here, Randall Grichuk, 3,300. That's going to project as a good point per dollar value. He most likely is going to get pinch hit for later in the game. So you do lose that final at bat or two if you're going to him. So do pay attention to his ownership as well. Rostering popular guys that are going to get pinch hit for it isn't great. Rostering guys that are going to get pinch hit for in general isn't great. But if you're going to do it, doing it with lower owned guys does make more sense. I don't expect that he'll get much ownership today, given the difficult matchup with Regans. Now, before we move to the game in Coors, as a reminder, if you have not already signed up for Endgame Syndicate, you can do so using the link in the description below. If you aren't already aware, that is the site that we launched about a month or two ago. Myself, Utica, Nerdy Tenor, Brick75, with the goal of providing intermediate and higher level DFS advice and training, helping you get better on your own so you're not as reliant on publicly available tools and shows like this one and all of that. You can build your own process easier, learn some things that successful players are doing that will make you more money over time, help you become more self-sufficient as well. If you haven't already signed up, now's a really good time to do so. One of the perks of a membership over there is access to our monthly roundtable, which is a live Q&A where all 4 of us answer your questions. We have one of those coming up at the end of the month. So it's a good time to sign up if you want to check it out. You won't have to wait too long to get that. I know Yuta also mentioned in our Discord yesterday that he will be starting to put out videos on his NFL process soon. So really good time to sign up now. Start getting ready for NFL. We obviously already have a bunch of videos up on MLB. I've laid out the process that I use in SaberSim. Brick has laid out things that he does in SaberSim to be more effective. He's put out videos on how to create your own projections, your own ownership projections. Yuta has talked about a lot of the things that he looks at in baseball that other people don't. Nerdy Tenor has a whole series, or several series already, of videos up diving into game theory components of DFS and showing you how you should approach different things and why. So I think it's a great site. I wish it had something like this had existed at any point in the last 10 years because I'm learning a lot. It would have kept me from making a lot of mistakes over the course of my DFS career. So I'm excited about that. And we have some good things coming moving forward as well. So check that out using the link in the description below. Now, getting to the game in Coors, Red Sox taking on the Colorado Rockies. On the mound for the Rockies, we have Austin Gomber, Tanner Houck going for the Red Sox. So we once again have a pretty popular pitcher in Coors Field. Tanner Houck, 8,500, reasonable price tag, good matchup against this terrible Rockies team. They rank 4th in strikeout percentage overall against right-handed pitching this year. They have an 88 WRC+. Now, those numbers are including their time outside of Coors, Coors is more difficult to get strikeouts, and obviously it's a better place to hit than basically anywhere. But overall, the Rockies are just a really, really bad offense, and Houck is a very good pitcher, striking out 23.5% of hitters with a 3.13 xFIP this year. I think he's going a little bit over-owned at 17%, but nothing too crazy. He showed up as optimal around 13% of the time for me. So I think that ownership mostly makes sense. Gomber on the other side, I think going a little under-owned just because he's 5K flat, and I've said it 100 times on these shows. Any major league starting pitcher that is 5K is underpriced. That being said, it's not a good matchup against the Red Sox. It's obviously a bad park to pitch in, and you're probably just not going to need to get to him on this slate. Houck, I think, is pretty clearly the pitching priority in this one. Red Sox are showing up as the second best overall stack. They are showing up middle of the road as far as 5-man stacks go. Gomber's not a horrible pitcher. He's not a great pitcher either. 182 expected ISO allowed to righties this year, 261 to lefties. One thing that I will be very interested to see is what exactly the Red Sox lineup looks like in this game, because I just mentioned it with Gomber, but he's given up a ton of power to lefties this year. He's not lights out against them. He gives up power to righties as well, but more to lefties. So I don't know what sort of lineup we're actually going to see from Boston. This is a team that does generally platoon pretty heavily. And so one thing that you have to be aware of when you're stacking them is that, especially when they're popular, is that there's the potential for significant pitch hit risk. Like if Wilyer Abreu doesn't start this game, and Yoshida doesn't start this game, or David Hamilton doesn't start this game, any of those guys are coming in to hit as soon as a right-handed reliever comes into the game. But if the Red Sox were to just look at Gomber's splits and say, no, we're going to go ahead and start all these lefties, then they actually do become a more appealing stack because you have a little bit less pitch hit risk. You also had Ref Snyder, I believe, either get scratched or leave yesterday's game early. I don't remember which one. Scratched from yesterday's game. So he is one of their right-handed bats. They do typically start against lefties. Assuming he's not available today, that actually makes them a little bit more appealing in tournaments because you don't have to deal with as much pinch risk headache. So paying attention to that lineup will be something that is interesting. I'll be talking about that in Discord, both for Endgame and for my Dub Club. Once we get that lineup, kind of talking through what I think the biggest risks are. But that is something to pay a lot of attention to. The guys that we know are not getting pinch hit for, Tyler O'Neill's hitting against everybody. Rafaela probably not getting pinch hit for, gives you some power and stolen base upside. We know Devers isn't getting pinch hit for. If Hamilton's in the lineup, you should be pretty safe there. Jaron Duran's staying in. So there are still going to be some guys that you definitely want to get to here. You can see overall this is a popular team. I like Devers in the lefty-lefty spot. I don't think he's going to get slept on. I don't think anybody's going into this slate saying, oh, I can't play Rafael Devers in Coors because the starting pitcher is left-handed, but you shouldn't either. It's still a very, very good spot for him. O'Neill looks great. Duran looks great. He's somebody whose skill set also can benefit from Coors Field because not only does the ball carry further in Coors Field, but to counteract that, this park has a massive outfield. The walls are very, very far away. As a result, there's a lot of ground to cover in the outfield. So Duran, somebody with speed like Duran, can take advantage by turning singles into doubles, doubles into triples, and getting you some more fantasy points that way. Obviously, he gives you some stolen base upside as well. So the Red Sox do, as a whole, look very good here. Just be sure to pay attention to the lineup itself and note anybody that does have or is likely to be pinch hit for as the game goes on. I will also talk about that more on my tournament show at 5 p.m. Hopefully, we will have a Red Sox lineup by then, but we may not. The Rockies on the other side, it is a tough matchup against Houck. They are still in Coors Field, so they have that going for them. And then you do have 15 to 20% ownership coming into Houck. So there is some merit in large field tournaments to considering the Rockies, just given the ballpark, their relatively low ownership and negative correlation with Houck. But obviously they are a much lower probability team than the Red Sox. Angels facing the Mariners in Seattle. So a huge park downgrade here for the Angels. Bryce Miller going for Seattle, Tyler Anderson for the Angels. Miller is getting a lot of ownership here at 8,400, projected for about 26%. It is a good matchup against the Angels in this park. Good park for strikeouts, good park for preventing runs. One of the best, most pitcher-friendly parks in baseball. The Angels' active roster ranks 13th in strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year with an 89 WRC+. Everything sets up pretty nicely for Bryce Miller. I understand why he's getting the ownership. That being said, it does just look like he's going a little bit over-owned to me. And I don't think that has to do with him or his matchup. I think it just has to do with the number of quality pitching options in this price range. Like if you just sort, that's not what I want to do. If you just go through this way, and so I'm sorting by projection if this loads, sorting by projection or not. Okay, so that's not going to work the way I wanted it to. But we've seen it as we talk through the slate so far that there are a lot of good pitchers in his price range. Maybe this way will work. Okay, so here, if you just sort by optimal percentage of pitchers, you can still get the gist of what I'm trying to say here. Hunter Green, 8,200. Snell is cheaper. Arrighetti against Oakland is cheaper than Miller. You have Miller. You have Houck at that price range. Bailey Ober's at that price range. Suarez isn't that much more expensive. You just have all of these arms, and Miller and Green are the two basically separating in terms of ownership, while a lot of the other guys are basically lumped together. From a range of outcome standpoint, even though Miller has a very, very good matchup, he's not really that different than all of these other guys. He doesn't have the same strikeout stuff that Hunter Green does, who is the other pitcher in that range that's separating. He has struck out about 22.5% of hitters this year, 3.94 xFIP. He's a good pitcher in a good matchup in a good park. It just looks like a spot where the field might be gravitating towards him a little bit more than they should. So again, not to say he's a bad option or you can't play him or anything like that, but from a range of outcome standpoint, he is very, very similar to a lot of guys that are just projected for like half the ownership that he's getting. Tyler Anderson on the other side, 8% projected ownership, 9% chance of being optimal. Not a great strikeout pitcher, not a great pitcher, period, but he does get a big park bump going into Seattle. He does get to face one of the best strikeout matchups that you can get going up against the Mariners. So secondary option, no problem with that, even though Anderson himself isn't very good. Offensively, it's always tough to get the offenses in this park, but Seattle does look somewhat interesting here going up against Anderson. Now, they are likely to not have Julio Rodriguez today, which will make them look worse. He was in the projected lineup that I used, so I do think that Seattle interest comes down for me, assuming that Rodriguez isn't in the lineup. He got hurt in yesterday's game. But Dylan Moore at 3,800, especially if he were to get a lineup bump, would be a pretty solid value option. Victor Robles, if he's the top of the lineup, is going to look like a good value, but he's another pinch hit risk guy, so keep that in mind. Robles is most likely not going to be playing against a right-handed reliever. He will probably get pinch hit for, but you do need to pay attention to who actually is available on the bench for Seattle. And then one other thing to keep in mind is that potentially if Rodriguez is out, maybe they need Robles to play center field. Off the top of my head, I don't actually know if they have other center fielders on their roster, but that is one thing potentially that could keep him in the game if Rodriguez doesn't play and they just don't have another center field option. I'll have a better answer for that on the 5:00 show. I'll have to go back and see who's actually played center field, but none of their other outfielders are guys that I know for sure play center. Jonathan Clase, I couldn't tell you what outfield position he plays. Haniger, I know generally is a right fielder. Raley's a corner outfielder. So there is some chance that if Rodriguez is out, that Robles actually doesn't have pinch hit risk and would need to stay in this game for defense. I'll have more on that at 5. But yeah, so Rodriguez's status matters for how interesting the Mariners look. But either way, you do have a cheap Jorge Polanco. You have a pretty cheap Cal Raleigh, given the amount of power that he has. Dylan Moore is going to look like a good value. Robles, if he's the top of the order, is going to look like a good value, especially if Rodriguez is out and he's playing center field. So there is some merit to getting to the Mariners here, even though the park sucks. Tyler Anderson, again, not a very good pitcher either. He is getting a nice park upgrade, but he has allowed a 176 expected ISO to righties this year, 198 to lefties. So I don't mind the Mariners, just given the upside that they have and the fact that they can fit pretty nicely into as secondary options into some other 5-man stacks as well. Next, we have Spencer Arrighetti taking on the A's in Oakland. Hogan Harris for the Athletics. Harris, very, very similar to Austin Gomber. Going on their own, not very interesting. Don't think you actually need him. Matchup with Houston sucks. He's just 5,300. The pitcher that I do think is interesting here is Spencer Arrighetti. 16% projected ownership, 17.5% chance of being optimal. He has been fine so far in the majors. Strikeout percentage is actually good at 25.5%. Everything else is not great. 12% walk percentage is certainly higher than you would like to see. 4.34 xFIP, 1.25 home runs allowed per 9 innings. But this is a tough park to hit home runs. It is a good park for limiting runs in general. We know that Oakland gives you a lot of strikeouts as well. They have the second highest strikeout percentage against right-handed pitching this year at 26%. They do also have a 107 WRC plus. They have a lot of power. This is a spot where I don't mind getting some Oakland bats against Arrighetti in non-Arrighetti lineups, but it's still certainly, obviously, a good matchup from an upside standpoint for Arrighetti. He's very reasonably priced at 7,800. I think he looks pretty good. Houston looks great. Again, this park isn't good, but the matchup against Harris is fine. This is a Houston lineup that has plenty of talent. Harris has allowed a 220 expected ISO to righties this year, 122 to lefties. Clearly, you can still go to Yordan Alvarez. He hits lefties very, very well, coming off of a cycle yesterday, which I didn't know he was capable of doing. But Alex Bregman, 4,200. That's just a cheap price tag for him going up against Harris. Alvarez, obviously very good. So is Altuve. Diaz is at one of his cheaper price tags at 4K. Pena's priced down. So this is a very inexpensive Houston team. And that's why they're showing up so much, even ahead of the Red Sox as far as stacks go, is if you just think about what you're able to put around Houston, not only are you getting a team that has one of the highest implied run totals on the slate, but you're just getting whatever pitching you want, whatever other hitting you want around this Houston stack. So it is going to create really, really high upside lineups. It is also going to make them somewhat popular. I'm surprised we're not seeing more ownership right now coming into Diaz and Pena. This is a spot that I'll pay attention to. Normally in the morning, when my optimal percentages are this much higher than projected ownership, one of two things happens. Either one, ownership projections across the industry just come up as the day goes on and they come in closer to what I'm at, or they don't come up and then you just end up being really pissed off because you enter your tournaments with a ton of Astros because everything you ran says that they're underowned, and then the field just plays them at a much higher rate than was projected. So one of those two things usually happens. If this were a situation where ownership still looks like this and my numbers still look like this as I get closer to lock, I would manually be bumping the ownership on guys like Diaz and Pena because they look like good values, but they also positively correlate to these popular guys like Bregman, Alvarez, and Altuve. So it's just really likely that their ownership ends up getting pulled up. Not to mention such a high percentage of players now are using sims, using this type of data, that if they're projected to be underowned by the industry, people's processes are just going to tell them to play Houston, and that's going to pull up ownership. So I think that if we get closer to lock and my numbers still look like this, I would manually be bumping Houston. I do think they end up being more popular than is being projected right now. That being said, they do still look very good. Again, it's not a good park for hitting home runs, but they still have a high implied run total. They are very, very cheap as well. And then finally, we have Blake Snell taking on the Dodgers in LA. Park upgrade for the Giants bats, park downgrade for Snell. River Ryan is going for the Dodgers. I honestly don't think I've ever seen that name before in my life. Not projected for much ownership. He looks like he is making his major league debut. Highly regarded pitching prospect. Fangraphs had him 34th overall coming into the season. 5 starts at AAA this year, only 16 innings pitched, so doesn't seem likely he's going super deep into this game. In his most recent start, he has been pitching more recently. 4 innings, 5 innings, 4 innings over his last 3. Faced 16 batters last time out, 21 before that. 7K price tag is reasonable. Again, I don't think he goes like super deep into this game, but he can probably give you 5 innings. Struck out 28.8% of hitters at AAA this year. Projects for around a 20% strikeout percentage right now in the majors. So looks like a good prospect, but currently, as of today, July 22nd, 2024, probably not somebody that we really need to worry about all that much on this slate, especially with how many good pitchers we do have in that like 7,500 to 9K range, I guess we can call it. On the other side, Blake Snell is one of those pitchers. Tough matchup for him against the Dodgers, no doubt about that. Park downgrade. This park is good for home runs. It's good for scoring runs. But Snell does give you huge strikeout upside. He's been around a while. We know what we're getting with him. But the thing that really stands out is that he is only $7,500. If he were $8,800 here, wouldn't really be that interesting. He would just be like, yeah, he's 5% owned, whatever. Use him if you need contrarian upside. But the fact that he's 7,500 mitigates a lot of this risk that you get going against the Dodgers, because 7,500 is very clearly less expensive than Blake Snell's talent level dictates. So that's why you're getting some ownership here. That's why he does show up as optimal, 15 to 20% of the time for me. Now, not only is it a scary matchup because the Dodgers just have good hitters, it is also a scary matchup just because they have good hitters. But I mean that in the sense that they have guys that probably are, or at least are a little bit more likely to be able to work counts against Blake Snell drive up his pitch count, cause problems, work walks, get on base, all of that stuff. But, again, he is only 7,500. There are some strikeouts in the Dodgers lineup, though they do strike out less against left-handed pitching than right-handed pitching. So scary spot for Snell, no doubt about it, but I do like that $7,500 salary. Steven Leibowitz in chat said that ESPN lists Dylan Moore and Raley as center fielders. I honestly had no idea Raley could play center. Dylan Moore, I was thinking that he could and was another option. Raley, I thought it was just like a first base corner outfield guy, but either way, if pay attention to what that lineup looks like. Like if Dylan Moore is starting at third base and Robles is in center and Rodriguez is out, then there is still pinch hit risk for Robles, but there's less. Whereas, like if Moore is starting in center and Robles is starting in left, there's a ton of pinch hit risk for Robles. So that'll still be something to pay attention to is, where is he starting and who is available on the bench. The Dodgers not really getting too much, not showing out much for me here. Neither are the Giants. They both look like secondary stacks. I don't mind getting to either one. You're getting a major league debut in Ryan. And while he does look to be a good prospect, he doesn't project to be great right out of the gate. The Giants are getting a nice park upgrade here. They are a team that you have to worry about platoons a little bit, but Ryan is right-handed, so it's not as big of a deal. Jorge Soler at 4,100 in this park is going to look pretty good. Matt Chapman, 4,300, good price tag there. Interesting pivot to like Alex Bregman, who's getting twice the ownership potentially. So I think the Giants look okay. They don't look great, but it is a nice park upgrade. I think they look okay. The Dodgers, tough matchup against Snell, certainly a talented pitcher, but you are getting the opportunity to get to the Dodgers against a popular pitcher, which doesn't happen all that often. So that does work in their favor, especially, in your larger field tournaments where negative correlation plays a little bit more of a role. Shohei Ohtani, obviously, anytime you can get to him, great. Looks like he's going a bit over-owned for me right now, projected for about 15% ownership. Showed up as optimal like 6% of the time. He is very, very expensive. And this is a slate where you have other guys to pay up for. You have the Red Sox in Coors where Devers is expensive, Duran's expensive, O'Neal's expensive. You have Ellie De La Cruz on the slate. You have Bobby Witt Jr. in a pretty good spot north of 6K. So to me, those guys all kind of cut into how much Ohtani I think I'll be able to get to, especially if Ohtani is going to actually get twice as much ownership as a lot of those guys. So that'll be something to pay attention to as well, is what exactly ends up happening with Shohei Ohtani's ownership. But if you can get to him in general, obviously it's the best, one of the best hitters in baseball. But on this particular slate right now, at least, I do think he's going a little bit over-owned. So a game where I think offensively, you can certainly make the case for either side, but I don't, at least right now, really love getting to either one. So to recap, there's a ton of good pitching on this slate. Hunter Green, Reynaldo Lopez look like the top two options to me. Blake Snell, Arrighetti, Miller, Houck, Reagans, Ober, Suarez, all certainly solid options as well in this like 7,500 to 9K range. Offensively, you get the Red Sox and Coors looking good. Houston looks good despite playing in Oakland, going up against Hogan Harris. Milwaukee, because of their pricing and positionality, I like quite a bit. What didn't really expect to against Javier Assad, but once we dug into that, I think they look good. And then there's just like a bunch of offenses that are fine. A bunch of like 4 to 4.5 implied run totals here that are pretty interchangeable. So I think ownership will play a pretty big role on this slate. I think you're going to get a lot of it coming into Coors Field, the Red Sox specifically. I think you're going to get a ton coming into the Astros. And then aside from that, I think it's kind of just going to be like play whatever teams you want. They're all, 5, 6, 7% owned. So should be a pretty interesting tournament slate. Ownership, again, I think is going to drive a lot of decision making. And I will dive into that more at 5 p.m. on my tournament show. If you haven't caught that, I did it every day for, I think, the week before All-Star break, where I go through my full lineup building process and look at what I would be playing in large field tournaments, dive into why I'm getting to some of that stuff, what maybe I don't like, what I do like, talk strategy. So a much more strategy-focused show than this one. That is at 5 p.m. Eastern on this channel, so be sure to check that out. Other than that, thanks for checking out the show. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you back here at 5 p.m. Eastern.